Marcus Holloway never expected his Tuesday morning routine to change the course of military aviation history. But as 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons broke formation 30,000 feet above his backyard garden in Millbrook, Kansas, executing a perfect ceremonial salute to a man watering his tomatoes, the Pentagon would soon demand answers that no one could provide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through Marcus Holloway's dream at exactly 5:47 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 8 years. At 52, Marcus had developed the kind of rigid routine that comes from decades of disappointment and the quiet acceptance that follows. His small ranch house on the outskirts of Millbrook, Kansas, sat on 3 acres of land that had once belonged to his grandfather, a wheat farmer who'd worked the soil until his fingers bled and his back permanently curved. Marcus shuffled to the kitchen, his bare feet finding the same creaky floorboards they'd found every morning since his divorce 3 years prior. The coffee maker gurgled to life with mechanical precision, filling the silence that had become his most faithful companion. Through the window above the sink he could see the garden that had become his obsession, his therapy, and perhaps his only remaining source of pride. The garden stretched across nearly half an acre behind his house, a testament to what happens when a man channels his loneliness into something productive. Neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and beans created geometric patterns visible from the second-story bedroom window. Marcus had started the garden the summer after Sarah left, mainly because he needed something to do with his hands besides reach for another beer. By 6:15 he was dressed in his standard uniform, faded Levi's, a gray cotton t-shirt that had seen better decades, and work boots that had molded to his feet like old friends. The morning air carried the peculiar stillness that comes just before dawn in the American Midwest, when the world holds its breath between night and day. Marcus filled his red plastic watering can from the outdoor spigot, the metal handle cold against his palm despite the approaching summer heat. The ritual had become sacred to him. Each plant received exactly the right amount of water, distributed with the care of a man who had learned that control over small things sometimes compensates for the chaos of larger ones. He started with the tomato plants, their green stems already showing the promise of fruit that would ripen in the coming weeks. The Cherokee Purples were his favorite, an heirloom variety he'd discovered through a seed catalog that arrived in his mailbox like a monthly reminder that hope could be ordered in small packets. As he moved methodically down each row, the repetitive motion cleared his mind of the usual morning anxieties about his job at the grain elevator, about the mortgage payment due next week, about the phone calls from his daughter Emma that came less frequently now. The sun crested the horizon as Marcus reached the pepper section, casting long shadows across the garden that would gradually shrink as the day progressed. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out its liquid song, and Marcus found himself humming along without realizing it. These were the moments that made everything else bearable, when the world reduced itself to soil and water and the simple satisfaction of nurturing something into existence. That's when he heard the engines. At first, it was just a low rumble, the kind of background noise that could have been a distant freight train or farm equipment. But as Marcus straightened up from watering his bell peppers, the sound grew more distinct, more purposeful. It was the unmistakable roar of jet engines, multiple aircraft moving in formation high overhead. Military flyovers weren't uncommon in Kansas. The state hosted several air bases, and training exercises regularly sent squadrons across the vast sky above the wheat fields and small towns. Marcus had grown accustomed to the occasional sonic boom, or the sight of fighter jets streaking across the horizon like mechanical eagles. But something about this formation felt different. Marcus shielded his eyes with his free hand and looked up, scanning the cloudless morning sky. 6 silver specks moved in perfect formation from the northwest, their contrails beginning to form thin white lines against the blue canvas above. They were flying lower than usual, low enough that Marcus could make out the distinctive silhouettes of F-16 Fighting Falcons. He'd always been fascinated by military aircraft, a childhood interest that had persisted despite never having served himself. An old back injury had kept him out of the Army when he was 18, a disappointment that had shaped many of the decisions that followed. But he still knew the difference between an F-16 and an F-15, could identify the sound of a C-130 transport versus a fighter jet, and had once spent an entire afternoon at an air show in Topeka learning about thrust-to-weight ratios from a patient Air Force recruiter. The formation was approaching directly overhead now, maintaining perfect alignment as they flew southeast toward what Marcus assumed was McConnell Air Force Base near Wichita. He continued watering his plants, glancing up occasionally to track their progress across the sky. The sound of their engines created a steady thunder that seemed to vibrate through his chest. That's when something extraordinary happened. The lead aircraft, visible now as a sleek F-16 with the morning sun glinting off its canopy, suddenly banked to the right. Not a gradual course correction, but a deliberate, sharp turn that broke the formation's straight line. Within seconds, the other 5 aircraft followed suit, their movements synchronized with military precision. Marcus stopped watering entirely, the red plastic can suspended in his grip as he watched the fighters execute a perfect aerial maneuver directly above his property. The formation shifted from a straight line into what any military aviation enthusiast would recognize as a ceremonial flyby formation, the kind reserved for air shows, military funerals, and official state ceremonies. The lead aircraft dipped its wings twice in the unmistakable gesture of aerial acknowledgement, followed immediately by the rest of the squadron. They held the salute for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Marcus to understand that this was no coincidence, no navigation error, no training exercise gone slightly off course. 6 United States Air Force F-16 Fighting Falcons had just executed a formal military salute to a middle-aged divorced man watering his garden in Millbrook, Kansas. Then, as suddenly as they had broken formation, the aircraft reformed their original line and continued southeast, their engines fading to a distant rumble before disappearing entirely over the horizon. The only evidence of what had occurred were the 6 contrails slowly dispersing in the morning breeze, and the absolute certainty in Marcus Holloway's mind that his quiet Tuesday morning had just become something else entirely. Marcus stood motionless in his garden for nearly 10 minutes, the watering can still gripped in his hand, staring at the empty sky where the impossible had just occurred. A red-winged blackbird landed on his tomato cage and began to sing, apparently unimpressed by the aerial display that had just unfolded overhead. Finally, Marcus set down the watering can and walked slowly back to his house, his mind racing through every possible explanation for what he had witnessed. Military exercises didn't include spontaneous salutes to random civilians. Fighter jets didn't break formation to acknowledge someone watering their garden. And yet, it had happened with such precision, such unmistakable intentionality, that doubt seemed more impossible than acceptance. Inside his kitchen, Marcus poured himself a second cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the strange exhilaration that comes when the ordinary world reveals itself to be far more mysterious than previously imagined. He had no idea that within the hour his phone would begin ringing with calls that would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. The first call came at 8:23 a.m. from a number Marcus didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing made him answer. "Mr. Holloway, this is Lieutenant Colonel Janet Pierce from McConnell Air Force Base Public Affairs. I need to ask you about an incident that occurred over your property this morning." Marcus nearly dropped his coffee mug. "How did you get my number?" "Sir, we have ways of identifying property owners in areas where our aircraft operate. I'm calling because we've received some unusual radar data that suggests one of our training formations may have deviated from their flight plan over your location. Can you confirm whether you observed any military aircraft around 7:15 this morning?" The specificity of the time sent a chill down Marcus's spine. They knew exactly when it had happened. "I saw 6 F-16s, yes, they were flying southeast." "Did you notice anything unusual about their flight pattern?" Marcus hesitated. How do you explain to an Air Force officer that their pilots had saluted your garden? "They seemed to change course briefly, came directly overhead." "Mr. Holloway, this is very important. Did the aircraft make any unusual maneuvers while over your property?" The weight of the question hung in the air. Marcus realized that his answer could have implications he couldn't even imagine. They dipped their wings, like they were acknowledging something. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Lieutenant Colonel Pierce finally spoke, her voice had taken on a different quality, more formal, more careful. Mr. Holloway, I'm going to need you to remain available today. Someone from our office will be in contact with you shortly to discuss this matter further. In the meantime, I would appreciate it if you didn't discuss this incident with anyone else. The line went dead before Marcus could respond. Within an hour, his phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a local number he recognized. Bill Hendricks from the Millbrook Gazette, the weekly newspaper that covered everything from high school football scores to city council meetings. Marcus, Bill Hendricks here. I just got the strangest call from someone claiming they saw military jets doing some kind of aerial maneuver over the west side of town this morning. You live out that way, don't you? See anything interesting? Marcus's mouth went dry. Someone else had witnessed it. Who called you, Bill? Mrs. Patterson, from the Dairy Queen. She was opening up this morning and swears she saw 6 fighter jets break formation and do some kind of salute over the farmland. Of course, Dolores has been known to see things that aren't always there, if you know what I mean. But she was pretty insistent about it. Said it looked like they were saluting someone or something. I wouldn't know anything about that, Marcus lied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Well, if you happen to remember seeing anything, give me a call. Could make for an interesting human interest piece. Military flyovers don't usually include air shows for the locals. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After Bill hung up, Marcus paced his living room like a caged animal. The morning had taken on a surreal quality, as if he'd stepped into someone else's life by mistake. He found himself questioning his own memory, wondering if perhaps he'd imagined the precision of the maneuver, the deliberate nature of the salute. But the phone calls proved otherwise. The military knew something had happened. A witness had seen it from town. This wasn't his imagination running wild. It was real, documented, and apparently significant enough to warrant official attention. At 11:47 a.m., a black SUV with government plates pulled into Marcus's driveway. 2 people emerged, a woman in an Air Force uniform with Lieutenant Colonel insignia, and a man in a dark suit who moved with the kind of controlled alertness that suggested military or intelligence background. Marcus watched them approach through his front window, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman knocked with authority but not aggression. When Marcus opened the door, she extended her hand with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mr. Holloway, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Janet Pierce. We spoke earlier. This is Agent David Chen from the Defense Intelligence Agency. May we come in? Marcus stepped aside, gesturing them into his modest living room. The furniture suddenly seemed shabby under their scrutiny, the coffee table's water rings and the slightly faded couch cushions taking on an embarrassing prominence. Agent Chen remained standing while Lieutenant Colonel Pierce took a seat across from Marcus. She opened a thin manila folder and consulted what appeared to be a typed report. Mr. Holloway, I want to be direct with you. At 07:01, 5 hours this morning, a formation of 6 F-16 aircraft from the 184th Intelligence Wing deviated from their planned flight path and executed what can only be described as a ceremonial flyby maneuver over your property. This deviation was captured on radar and observed by ground personnel at McConnell. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay. What's not okay, Agent Chen interjected, speaking for the first time, is that none of the pilots involved can explain why they did it. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus felt his worldview shifting, the solid ground of rational explanation crumbling beneath his feet. What do you mean they can't explain it? He asked. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, all 6 pilots are experienced aviators with impeccable records. When questioned separately about the deviation, each one gave essentially the same account. They felt compelled to perform the maneuver. They can't explain the compulsion, can't identify what triggered it, and several described the experience as being outside their conscious control. That's impossible. We thought so too, Agent Chen said, which is why we're here. We need to understand what happened over your property this morning. And more importantly, we need to understand why it happened. Marcus looked between the 2 officials, searching their faces for some sign that this was an elaborate practical joke. But their expressions remained deadly serious, their body language suggesting people dealing with a situation that fell well outside normal parameters. I was just watering my garden, Marcus said weakly. "Tell us exactly what you were doing when the aircraft approached your position," Lieutenant Colonel Pierce requested, pulling out a digital recorder. Marcus recounted his morning routine, the watering schedule, the moment he first heard the engines. As he spoke, both officials took notes, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested silent communication. "Have you ever seen these particular aircraft before?" Agent Chen asked. "I wouldn't know one F-16 from another, but military jets fly over pretty regularly. It's nothing unusual." "What about the timing? Was there anything significant about this particular morning? Any anniversary, personal milestone, anything that might have made today different from other days?" Marcus searched his memory. No, it was just Tuesday. Nothing special about it at all. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce consulted her folder again. "Mr. Holloway, I need to ask you some personal questions. Have you ever served in the military?" "No. I wanted to, but I had a back injury in high school that disqualified me." "Any family members currently serving or recently deceased who served?" "My grandfather was in World War II, but he died 15 years ago. My ex-wife's brother is in the Navy, but we don't really keep in touch." Agent Chen stepped closer. "Have you had any recent contact with military personnel? Any reason why someone in the Air Force might know who you are or where you live?" "Not at all. I work at the grain elevator, keeping to myself mostly. I don't even go to the VFW or anything like that." The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from Marcus's employment history to his medical records to his social media presence. With each query, it became increasingly clear that there was nothing in his background that could possibly explain why 6 military aircraft had spontaneously saluted him while he watered his vegetables. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce closed her folder and exchanged a long look with Agent Chen. "Mr. Holloway, what happened here this morning has no precedent in our records. We've dealt with equipment malfunctions, pilot error, even psychological episodes, but we've never encountered a situation where multiple aircraft crews simultaneously experienced what can only be described as an unexplained compulsion to honor a civilian." "What does that mean for me?" Marcus asked. Agent Chen's expression remained neutral. "It means we'll be keeping this incident under investigation. We'll also be monitoring your property and maintaining contact with you in case anything similar occurs." "Are you saying this might happen again?" "We're saying we don't know what happened the first time," Lieutenant Colonel Pierce admitted. "Until we do, we can't rule out anything." After they left, Marcus stood in his doorway watching the black SUV disappear down the county road. The afternoon sun beat down on his garden, where the tomatoes and peppers waited patiently for their evening watering. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but nothing would ever feel the same again. He had become part of something unexplainable, something that had captured the attention of military intelligence and defied rational explanation. And the most unsettling part was the growing certainty that this was only the beginning. 3 weeks passed without incident. Marcus maintained his morning routine, though now he found himself scanning the sky with nervous anticipation each time he stepped into his garden. The tomatoes had begun to ripen, their deep purple and red hues creating splashes of color against the green foliage, but even this small triumph felt hollow under the weight of constant surveillance. The black SUV no longer parked in his driveway, but Marcus had spotted it on several occasions at the end of his road. Agent Chen had given him a business card with instructions to call immediately if anything unusual occurred, and the phone number had become a constant presence in Marcus's wallet, like carrying around a loaded weapon he hoped never to use. During this period of enforced normalcy, Marcus began to notice things he'd never paid attention to before. His neighbors seemed to watch him differently now, their waves carrying undertones of curiosity mixed with suspicion. Betty Morrison from the house across the county road had started finding excuses to walk her ancient basset hound past his property twice a day, her eyes always drifting skyward as she passed his garden. The grain elevator where Marcus worked had become a different kind of prison. His supervisor, Dale Kruger, had developed the habit of asking pointed questions about Marcus's visitors, and whether everything was okay at home. The other workers maintained polite distance, as if military investigations were contagious. Even his lunch breaks felt observed, every sandwich eaten under the weight of unspoken questions. Sleep became elusive. Marcus would lie awake listening to every sound outside his bedroom window, wondering if the soft whoosh of wind through his maple trees might be the distant rumble of approaching aircraft. His dreams filled with formations of silver jets, performing impossible aerial ballets above cornfields that stretched to infinity. The media attention had been mercifully brief, though its effects lingered like smoke in still air. Bill Hendricks had run a small piece in the Millbrook Gazette about unusual military maneuvers observed by local residents, but without official confirmation or dramatic footage, the story had died a natural death. Mrs. Patterson from the Dairy Queen had become something of a local celebrity for a few days, regaling customers with increasingly embellished accounts of the aerial display. Her version had evolved to include loop-de-loops and skywriting, transforming a 3-second salute into a 20-minute air show complete with smoke trails spelling out patriotic messages. But even her enthusiasm had waned when no follow-up incidents occurred, and the story gradually faded into the background noise of small-town gossip. Yet Marcus noticed that certain details from her exaggerated accounts had taken root in the local collective memory. People now remembered seeing things that had never happened, their recollections contaminated by Dolores Patterson's creative embellishments. The experience taught Marcus something unsettling about the nature of truth in small communities. Reality could be rewritten by repetition, facts blurred by the human need to make extraordinary events even more extraordinary. He wondered if this was how all unexplained phenomena eventually became legend, truth buried beneath layers of retelling until the original incident became unrecognizable. Marcus had almost convinced himself that life might return to normal when his phone rang at 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning in late July. "Mr. Holloway?" The voice was unfamiliar, younger than Agent Chen or Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, with a slight tremor that suggested nervousness. "Yes." "Sir, this is Captain Rebecca Torres, 184th Intelligence Wing. I was one of the pilots involved in the incident over your property last month. I need to speak with you." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I was told not to discuss this with anyone." "Sir, I'm calling against orders. There's something you need to know, something my superiors aren't telling you." "Can we meet?" The desperation in her voice cut through Marcus's caution. "Where?" "There's a truck stop called Murphy's about 15 miles east of your place on Highway 36. Can you be there in an hour?" Marcus arrived at Murphy's to find a young woman in civilian clothes sitting alone in a corner booth, nervously shredding a paper napkin. Captain Torres looked to be in her early 30s with short dark hair and the kind of intense focus that comes from years of precision flying. Dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights, and her civilian clothes, a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis, seemed like a costume worn by someone more comfortable in a flight suit. She stood when she saw him approach, extending her hand with military formality, but Marcus noticed the slight tremor in her grip. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holloway. I know this is irregular." Her voice carried the clipped precision of someone accustomed to radio communications, but underneath lay something else. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of carrying dangerous knowledge. The truck stop buzzed with the usual morning activity. Long-haul drivers nursed coffee and complained about dispatch schedules, while local farmers discussed crop prices and weather patterns. The normalcy of it all created a surreal backdrop for what Marcus sensed would be a conversation that would change everything he thought he understood about his situation. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holloway. I know this is irregular." They sat across from each other, and Marcus noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "What did you want to tell me?" he asked. Captain Torres glanced around the truck stop, confirming they weren't being observed. "Mr. Holloway, what happened over your property wasn't an isolated incident. It was the third time something like this has occurred in the past 18 months, and I have reason to believe there have been others that haven't been documented or have been covered up entirely." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean?" "The first incident I can verify happened over a farm in Nebraska. An elderly woman named Dorothy Zimmerman was feeding chickens in her yard when our squadron executed an unplanned ceremonial flyby. Just like with you, none of us could explain why we did it. We were debriefed, the incident was classified, and we were ordered not to discuss it under penalty of court-martial." She paused to sip her coffee, her hands steadier now that she'd begun sharing her burden. "The debriefing was unlike anything I'd experienced in my military career. Instead of the usual operational review, we were questioned by psychologists, subjected to medical examinations, and required to submit to polygraph tests. They were looking for signs of external influence, foreign interference, anything that could explain why 6 trained pilots simultaneously broke formation to honor a civilian." "And the second?" "A man named Thomas Valdez in Colorado. He was fixing a fence on his ranch when we saluted him from 25,000 feet. Same unexplained compulsion, same mysterious inability to remember making the decision to deviate from our flight plan. But this time, The aftermath was different. Captain Torres leaned forward, lowering her voice further. After the Valdez incident, they separated us for individual interrogations. Each pilot was questioned by different teams, our testimonies compared for inconsistencies. They brought in specialists from the Pentagon, people whose job titles were classified and whose questions suggested they'd encountered similar phenomena before. Quote, Marcus absorbed this information, his worldview continuing its steady collapse into something far stranger and more complex than he'd imagined possible. Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. Why are you telling me this? Captain Torres leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because yesterday, I received new orders. We're being deployed to the Middle East for an extended rotation. All 6 pilots who participated in these incidents are being reassigned to different units, scattered across the globe. They're breaking up the squadron. They think you're compromised somehow? That's what I thought at first. But then I did some digging. Mr. Holloway, Dorothy Zimmerman died 2 days after our flyby. Natural causes, they said, but she was in perfect health. Thomas Valdez disappeared 3 weeks after our salute over his ranch. His truck was found abandoned near the Colorado-Utah border. No body, no explanation, no trace. The truck stop suddenly felt too warm, too confined. Marcus loosened his collar, struggling to process what he was hearing. You think something happened to them because of the flyovers? I think the flyovers happened because something was going to happen to them. Mr. Holloway, I've been flying for 12 years. I've never experienced anything like the compulsion that made us salute you. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like someone else was controlling the aircraft, like we were being guided by something outside ourselves. Marcus thought about the precision of the maneuver, the perfect synchronization of 6 separate aircraft performing a ceremonial action with no prior planning or communication. What are you suggesting? Captain Torres pulled a manila envelope from her jacket and slid it across the table. I copied everything I could find about the previous incidents before my security clearance was revoked. Photographs, incident reports, witness statements, medical evaluations of the pilots involved. I think someone or something is using military aircraft to mark people, to honor them before... She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope and saw photographs of Dorothy Zimmerman's farm, Thomas Valdez's ranch, and his own property, all taken from high altitude during the mysterious flyovers. But there were other documents as well. Psychological profiles of the selected individuals, detailed background investigations, and most disturbing of all, predictive behavioral analyses that seemed to forecast future actions with uncanny accuracy. Jesus, Marcus whispered, scanning a report that described him as highly likely to exhibit extraordinary heroism under crisis conditions, and statistically probable to risk personal safety for strangers' welfare. The profiles were created after each incident, Captain Torres explained. But here's what doesn't make sense. They read like they were written by someone who already knew what these people would do, not someone trying to figure it out. Marcus studied a photograph of Dorothy Zimmerman, a slight woman in her 70s wearing a faded house dress and feeding chickens from a metal pan. According to the attached report, she had died saving 3 children from a house fire 2 days after the aerial salute, succumbing to smoke inhalation after ensuring all the children escaped safely. Thomas Valdez's file painted the picture of a quiet rancher who had disappeared while attempting to rescue trapped hikers during a flash flood in a remote canyon. His truck had been found at the edge of the ravine, along with climbing equipment and rope that suggested he had descended into the dangerous waters. Neither he nor the hikers were ever found, but tire tracks and witness statements indicated that several vehicles had left the area around the time the floodwaters receded. Why are you risking your career to tell me this? Because whatever force made us salute you hasn't finished with you yet. And because Dorothy Zimmerman and Thomas Valdez didn't know what was coming. Captain Torres stood up, leaving money on the table for her untouched coffee. Mr. Holloway, I don't know what you did to deserve that salute, but I think it was recognition for something extraordinary, something that hasn't happened yet. After she left, Marcus sat alone in the truck stop booth for nearly an hour, staring at the photographs and documents spread before him. The images showed 3 ordinary people going about their daily routines, unaware that they had been selected for something beyond their understanding. But now he could see patterns he'd missed initially. Each photograph captured a moment of quiet dedication. Dorothy Zimmerman caring for her animals despite her advanced age. Thomas Valdez maintaining his property alone after his wife's death, Marcus himself tending his garden with methodical precision. They were all people who had chosen to nurture and maintain rather than exploit or abandon. The psychological profiles were even more revealing. All three individuals scored high on measures of empathy, self-sacrifice, and what the military psychologists termed altruistic courage, the willingness to risk personal safety for others' benefit. But these weren't qualities that could be observed from 30,000 feet or determined through standard background checks. Marcus found himself wondering about the source of this information. How could anyone predict with such accuracy that Dorothy Zimmerman would run into a burning building, that Thomas Valdez would attempt a dangerous rescue, or that he himself would leave everything behind to help disaster victims? The implications suggested surveillance so comprehensive and predictive modeling so advanced that it bordered on the supernatural. But perhaps most unsettling was a handwritten note attached to his own file, apparently added by someone with higher clearance than the original investigators. Subject exhibits classic pre-heroic behavioral patterns. Recommendation: maintain passive observation until catalyst event occurs. Do not interfere with natural progression. The clinical language couldn't disguise what the note revealed. Someone or some organization was tracking potential heroes, identifying them before their defining moments arrived, and somehow coordinating military aircraft to acknowledge them in advance. He drove home slowly, his mind churning through impossible scenarios and rational explanations that no longer seemed adequate. The afternoon sun slanted across his garden as he pulled into his driveway, illuminating the rows of vegetables that had become the center of his small world. But now the garden looked different to him, transformed by knowledge into something more significant than a retired man's hobby. Each carefully tended row represented hours of selfless labor, the kind of patient dedication that apparently marked someone as worthy of aerial recognition. He wondered if there were others like him, people going about their ordinary lives while unknowingly preparing for extraordinary moments. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself researching unexplained military flyovers, scouring online forums and local newspaper archives for reports of similar incidents. The search yielded frustratingly little concrete information, but he did discover scattered reports of unauthorized military maneuvers over civilian areas, most dismissed as training exercises or navigational errors. One report from Montana described 6 Air Force jets performing what appeared to be a ceremonial salute over an isolated ranch house. Another from Wyoming mentioned F-16s breaking formation to acknowledge a man working in his fields. In each case, military officials had provided routine explanations about training exercises, and local media had treated the incidents as amusing curiosities rather than meaningful events. Marcus began to suspect that what had happened to him was part of a much larger phenomenon, one that had been systematically obscured or explained away by official channels. The pattern suggested an organization with the resources to coordinate military aircraft across multiple states, and the influence to ensure that such coordination never attracted serious investigation. That evening, as Marcus watered his plants under a sky painted orange and purple by the setting sun, he found himself listening for the sound of jet engines. Not with fear, but with a strange sense of anticipation, as if he were waiting for a summons he didn't yet understand. The weight of Captain Torres's revelations had fundamentally altered his relationship with his own life. Every action now carried the potential for greater significance. Every choice might be part of a larger pattern he was only beginning to glimpse. The quiet satisfaction he'd once derived from his garden routine had been replaced by a restless energy, a sense that he was living in the prelude to something momentous. As summer turned to fall, Marcus began making subtle changes to his lifestyle. He started monitoring emergency radio frequencies, familiarized himself with first aid procedures, and quietly upgraded his truck with emergency supplies and communication equipment. He told himself these were reasonable precautions for anyone living in rural Kansas, but deep down he knew he was preparing for a calling he couldn't yet define. His dreams during this period were filled with recurring images, vast disasters unfolding across television screens, desperate voices calling for help from flooded cities, and always, somewhere in the distance, the thunder of jet engines acknowledging sacrifices not yet made. The transformation was so gradual that Marcus hardly noticed it happening. Neighbors began commenting on his increased attention to community affairs, his willingness to help with local problems, and his growing reputation as someone who could be counted on in a crisis. Betty Morrison mentioned that she'd never seen anyone take better care of their property, and Dale Kruger noted that Marcus had become the most reliable employee at the grain elevator. But Marcus was aware of a deeper change, something that went beyond mere civic responsibility. He felt increasingly connected to the suffering of strangers, moved by news reports in ways that had never affected him before. The aerial salute hadn't just marked him as a potential hero, it had awakened something dormant in his character, a capacity for sacrifice that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. 3 months later, when Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, Marcus Holloway would leave his quiet life in Kansas to drive a truck loaded with supplies to New Orleans. He would spend the next 6 weeks pulling survivors from flooded buildings, organizing relief efforts, and saving dozens of lives with a courage and determination that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. The local news would eventually run a story about the unlikely hero from Kansas, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere to become one of the most effective volunteer rescue coordinators in the disaster zone. They would interview neighbors who described Marcus as a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself and grew vegetables. None of them would mention the morning when 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons had broken formation to salute a man watering his garden, or the possibility that some force beyond human understanding had recognized heroism before it had the opportunity to manifest itself. Marcus never received another mysterious phone call, never saw Captain Torres again, and never learned what became of the classified investigation into the aerial salutes. But sometimes, during quiet moments in his garden, he would look up at the empty sky and wonder if somewhere, somehow, the universe keeps track of the good we're capable of doing, even before we know it ourselves. The tomatoes that year were the finest he'd ever grown. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.